Okay, guys, we are welcome back, and this is Psych 337. That is learning. Today we'll be looking at some of the theories, such as classical conditioning, operant conditioning, or operant stroke instrumental conditioning in our day-to-day lives, meaning application of these theories in different phases of life. So we'll be starting with classical conditioning. So we'll be doing some quick revision on what classical conditioning is, who is the proponent or who were the proponents and all that. So without wasting of much time, my name is Siddik Salis, and you're all welcome. So let's get started. Again, I'm using Dr. Inusa's slides because, like I said yesterday, it's more simplified. So like I said, if you have anything to talk about or any comment or something, you can put it in typing so I can easily see it. Okay, so before we get to the application, we'll be looking at the definition for classical conditioning. You'll be asking yourself, why are we going to go through this revision? Why don't we go straight to the topic and discuss the topic? Because at least we've been given areas. The areas you've been given, however, it's limited to certain topics. And you should not lose sight of the feeling part and then the objective part. We shouldn't lose sight of that. So it means that whilst we'll be tackling the given essay questions, or it's not questions, let me say topics, would also be paying attention to the feeling part and then the objective aspect. Okay, so we'll be doing things in the form of revision. We'll be doing this in the form of revision, whilst we are also keeping focus on the essay questions. So we wouldn't lose focus on any or either of them. Okay, so we're looking at the definition of classical conditioning. The outline, we'll be able to outline the history of classical conditioning. What was the history behind it? The elements and features of classical conditioning. When we say classical conditioning, how would you identify that this particular learned phenomenon is classical conditioning? We'll also discuss some factors affecting classical conditioning, or that affect or can affect classical conditioning. And then we'll come to how classical conditioning can be applied to humans. Then we come to the application. Okay, so let's get started. I'll be just looking here and summarize this, some of these things. Then we'll get into the written part of the slide. So let's take the first one, define what classical conditioning is. Okay, so there are two words here, classical and conditioning. Now, most of us are familiar with the word classic. So when we say something is classical, it means there is a precedence. There is a precedent. Something has taken place, something that has taken place before or some time ago. So we refer to classical conditioning. So now we come to the conditioning. Conditioning means something happens under a given condition. So when we say we are conditioning this, I'm saying that there is the if factor, if and then factor, okay? Meaning that if you give me the book, then I'll give you the money. Okay, so there is a condition here. It means that the money will be given to the other party only when, the money will be given to the other party only when the book has been delivered. So that's the conditioning. So now the giving of the money is under a condition. Okay, for me to give the money, the condition is that you have to give me the book first. You have to deliver the book first. Sometimes we deal with these things during our day-to-day activities when we are ordering something from online or something. Okay, so Basically, that is what conditioning means. So when you say classical conditioning, now from here you will understand that we are talking about, yes, when we say classical conditioning, you will understand that I've explained the compound words, okay, the compound word, classical and conditioning. We say classical means something that has already done what? Taken place already, okay? Something that has preceded an old stuff, right? So we have something like classical music, classic watch, meaning they are like old type of stuff. Okay, then we have conditioning, meaning something will be done under certain condition. So we are conditioning the old stuff, okay, for something to happen under that. Now, if you're watching this video, it means, or if you are here, it means you should be someone who is familiar with these terms already. However, your understanding should be enhanced. Your understanding should be more than when you were in level 100 or 200. Okay, so from here, you shouldn't just be saying, from today, you shouldn't just be saying classical conditioning without knowing what you're saying. From today, when you say classical conditioning, you should understand classic. And when something is classical and then conditioning, it's a compound word, like I said. When we are ordering things from online, we can say that we will only pay, or we will pay. So we will pay if you bring me the item. Okay, we will pay after delivery, meaning without delivery, we are not going to pay. So our payment is conditioned. Okay, the payment here, the money to be given to the seller is under a condition. What is the condition? Delivery. Okay, good. So that is the condition here. So classical conditioning, we are conditioning what? An old stuff for something to happen under that. So when if you remember, like I said, if you're here, then you are familiar with issues like this. If you remember, and I believe you remember, the Ivan Pavlov of the Pavlovian experiment, as it is being called, the Pavlovian experiment. If you recall, there would be an old stuff that has preceded, which is called the neutral stimulus. Then the neutral stimulus would be followed by, an unconditioned stimulus. Here, we want the organism to respond to this neutral stimulus, which will eventually become the conditioned stimulus. We will explain this into details, don't worry. I'm trying to explain, define, and explain the classical conditioning for all of us, okay? So the dog, for example, that's the organism here, is being conditioned to respond to the, how do you call it? The conditioned stimulus, that is the bell, which was neutral from the beginning, eventually becoming the conditioned stimulus. The dog should respond to it. That's what we want. The dog should respond to it. Under that condition, if the dog believes that under the condition of the bell, there would be food. So in condition statements or conditional statement, we are going to say that if the bell rings, then the meat powder will come. So the dog is conditioned to respond to the sound of the bell. So that is the condition here. And that is why it is called classical conditioning. It's also called classical because of the time it took place. It was done in the year, the 1900s. That's 1900 by Ivan Pavlov. In this slide, I think that was an oversight of our lovely doctor. He called him a psychologist. Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist. I think that's an oversight, which as humans, we are bound to commit those mistakes. So it was an old stuff that later how do you call it? The people of operant conditioning and instrumental learning, such as Edward Thorndike and Behet Frederick Skinner, they came later and then they built on it to develop their theories. They based on the classical one. So classical first, because it was later, we had new behaviorists that came after that, or new behaviorists, such as B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike and the rest. Okay. J.B. Watson and all these people. They came after Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. So like I said, I'm trying to, for those who just joined, we've already started. I've done the introduction, and the reason we are doing this kind of preambles or this kind of discussion or revision for the sake of the feelings and how do you call it, the objective. So in case you are joining now, we've already started, and I said that I'm summarizing the whole slides before we start going into its details. So guys, from today, I believe we understand when we say classical conditioning, because there's something that has preceded a stimulus that has preceded, and it will be followed by an unconditioned stimulus, and the organism is expected under a condition that if the bell rings, there would be food. Therefore, the dog will be responding to the classical one, the old one. What is the old one that preceded? The bell. In the case of the Pavlovian experiment, the bell is the conditioned stimulus here, which was initially the how do you call it, the neutral stimulus. So we've used some minutes to discuss this, and I believe and pray that it will never depart from you. When we say classical conditioning, what do we mean by classical conditioning? We say classical because we have new. We also say classical because we have new behaviorists. New behavior meaning people who came later and modified and built upon someone's studies. So both are correct. Your understanding from level 100, I believe, has been enhanced at this point. Now let's go to the next topic under the things that we are expected to know by the end of this session. Okay, so the next one is the history of classical conditioning. So you see, I've already mentioned the history, okay, started by Ivan Pavlov in the 1900s. Yes, he was a Russian physiologist. He was a medical doctor who was conducting research on digestion. I believe we've all heard this right from level 100 or 200. So in the studies, whilst he was doing this, he discovered that humans have some behaviors that we learn. Okay, we are not born with everything. We actually learn certain things under certain conditions. So he discovered that, and then he took the studies a bit further, and therefore he was acknowledged, or he has been acknowledged in psychology for a very long time now. Don't forget that this is a revision, and therefore I'll be skipping some parts that I would deem not too relevant at this point. Okay, so we'll also be talking about this. Explain the element and features of classical conditioning. How do we identify classical conditioning? That is the features, okay? The features. And then the elements. What are the things that come to build classical conditioning, such as when you are building a house? What are the things we use in building the house for the house to have its features of a house? What are the elements we need? Okay, if you can answer that, then that is what the same thing we'll be looking out for when we are talking about the elements of classical conditioning. Now, let's go into the slides. We've answered most of the things here already. Therefore, I will just be reading. And that's why I started by summarizing this very point. Okay, so it started in the 1900s. We've said that already, by a Russian. You see here, this is the mistake I said. I think it was an oversight. A Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov. So he was a physiologist. In case this appears in your objectives, do not mistakenly choose psychologist. It usually appears. Okay, so don't make that mistake. Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist, a Russian physiologist, who was investigating digestion, like I said. Okay, so I will skip all this part, like I've already said. Pavlov, I'm coming here. Pavlov recognized that the dog's association of these sights and sounds with the food was an important type of learning, which came to be called classical conditioning. We've said all this from the beginning. So in case you are now joining, we'll summarize everything here. So that in case maybe you want to go and read your slides again, everything, if you listen from the beginning, everything has been summarized there. As we said, the introduction, this introduction. Okay. So we are going straight to the elements of classical conditioning. Now, things we use in building classical conditioning. So let me take this, let me stop sharing this and focus on. Okay, so when we are building classical conditioning, like I said, it's just like building, I saw a landlord in the house. A landlord is back to school learning psychologist, I guess. Or he came to cheer us up. Okay, so when we are building classical conditioning, there are some elements, there are some meaning, some things we need to build classical conditioning. For it to have or to have its depiction or picture of classical conditioning. And I hope you've not forgotten them. There are some terms that is usually given to this stuff, such as neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, then unconditioned response, then conditioned stimulus, then unconditioned response, conditioned response. So let's put neutral stimulus at the top. Usually I pair it with natural response or unconditioned response. So neutral stimulus will give you unconditioned response. We explained that anyways. Then we have unconditioned stimulus. So neutral stimulus, we say unconditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus, different thing now, right? Unconditioned stimulus gives unconditioned response. Then conditioned stimulus, we have conditioned response. So these are the elements that we need to understand them. These are the elements we need to understand. So let's start with neutral stimulus. When we say something is neutral, basically the thing is not adding or subtracting. That's basically what it means. This is what it means in physics. This is what it means in life. This is what it means in English. When we say a neutral stimulus or a neutral energy, meaning it's not adding, there's no addition and there's no subtraction. So it's not going, it's not coming back. It's neutral, it is not positive or negative. Okay, so for example, I always use this as an example. Let's take the ringing of a bell. There are lots of people, when they break, they ring bells in our areas. And from the beginning, it doesn't tell anything. Those bells don't mean anything to us. But at the same time, the same bell or the same size, when you are in school, especially when we're in primary and JHS, when that bellboy comes out to ring the bell, it then gives us certain information. It informs us about something. And what do? We respond to it in a certain way. Okay, so there's a bell and a time, paired with a time. If it is rung, the bell is rung at that time, what do? We rush to break. It informs us about break. When this bell is rung again in certain time, paired to a certain time, it gives us another information, break over. So you see, the bell in general in our house, this bell, they don't mean anything to us. But when paired with something, it then starts to give us certain information, and it conditions us to act in certain ways. Now let's come to the Pavlovian studies, the Pavlovian experiment, Ivan Pavlov. And let's use these terms there. We already know them, so I'm rushing through them. Okay, if you have something, want me to break at a certain point, you can just type it, okay? Okay, so Ivan Pavlov, when he was conducting his studies on digestion, he realized that whenever food is being brought to the dog salivates, right? Dog drools and salivates. He observed that and he was like, okay, let me take this. This is something I have to take further. What did he do then? Then instead of the dog hearing the footsteps of the guard or something, he intended to pair the food with the bell. Now, we are going to use the terms here, so let's pay attention. This is just a revision for you. I know, it's just a revision for you. So he had a bell, which initially was nothing to the dog, okay? Then he started pairing, pay attention, okay. I know online studies, sometimes some of us, we can be online and at the same time we are offline. So let's pay attention because these terms are going to spread through, including some types of classical conditioning. We've learned some classical conditioning, which is actually the classical conditioning that everybody knows. Okay, everyone knows that. How do you call it? Classical conditioning. That is the forward conditioning. We all know. So that's what I'm talking about. After that, we will just start dissecting it bit by bit. Okay, so the bell initially was a neutral stimulus, meaning it does not increase nor negate. It doesn't increase nor negate anything from the dog's behavior, right? But at a point when the bell, before the food is being brought, the meat powder is being brought to the dog, it will be preceded by the bell. So there'll be a sound of the bell followed by the meat powder. The bell here is the neutral stimulus from the beginning, followed by unconditioned stimulus. The dog will then just respond to the food. That's all. The unconditioned stimulus will just give unconditioned response. That's all. But then after some time, when the, how do you call it? The neutral stimulus was paired to the unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat powder, the dog starts to respond to the bell with the expectation of the arrival of meat powder, okay? When the bell rings, he's now expecting meat powder. Let me ask, we as Ghanaians, if you are listening as a Ghanaian, then you know this. When we are in the house or wherever we are, and thunder start to strike, water, like, how do you call it? Rain start to fall with thunder. What do we expect? There's something that we all expect when these things are happening. Let me unmute in case you want to answer this. And I believe the first person should get this correct. I believe the person will get it correct. What do you expect when you're in Ghana and there is thunder and rain, or it starts to rain, especially in the evening? What do we expect? Or in the night? Can someone
lightning.
What?
Lightning. Lightning.
Okay, there's lightning, that's the thunder. There's lightning, there is rain. What do you expect in Ghana?
Light off.
Light out.
They're Ghanaian there, then you know this. So the moment there is a strike of thunder and rain, we are expecting light out, blackout. No way, no two ways about this, right? So that is classical, a perfect example for classical conditioning. Okay, that's a perfect. So the dog now starts to, when there's a bell, he starts to expect, how do you call it? Food, the meat powder. But remember what classical conditioning is. Classical conditioning, there is a pair, it's part of the associative learning. We want the organism to respond to the old stimulus, what is the old stimulus? The neutral stimulus, which will become the conditioned stimulus. We want the organism to respond to that, right? Therefore, we paired it with something that the organism wants or likes or doesn't like, something that the organism likes or doesn't like, okay? And here, in this case, the organism likes the meat powder. So we will pair that with what we want the organism to actually respond to. For example, if I want my, how do you call it? my guard, let's say my security, who started working in the house, and let's say he's scared of dogs or my dog. Okay, although I don't have a dog, I don't have a security. The only security I have right now is the security of where I work. Okay, so let's say I have a house, I have a security, and I have, how do you call it? A dog. This security is very good, but the problem is that he's just scared of the dog. What do I do then? I have to now start bringing up something that will make the security like the dog. Or let me make it vice versa. The dog should like the security because maybe actually the dog bites. So I'll let the security, anytime the dog sees the security gives the dog food. He sees the security gives the dog food. Now at this point, it is the security I want the dog to respond to positively, like not to bite him or something. And also when he sees him, he sees the security, he should like be happy. So then I associated food with the security. You understand? So then when he sees the security, he's expecting something positive and therefore will not respond. So you see, all the time we want the organism to respond to something like, how do you call it? The old stuff, the one that precedes. We want, but then we'll associate it with something that the dog likes or dislikes, the organism likes or dislikes. When it comes to dislikes, it's like a baby who is breastfeeding, okay? A lactating mother, when he wants the child to stop breastfeeding, the lactating mother would then associate the breast with, how do you call it? The breast with something aversive. This is called the aversion therapy, okay? We'll associate it with something aversive, meaning something that is unpleasant, something that the baby will not like. Associated with the breast, and then anytime the child now comes to it, the child will feel aversive, and eventually the child will go away from the breast. So that is classical conditioning. And these terms, neutral stimulus, we say that becomes the conditioned stimulus eventually. Then unconditioned stimulus. So these are the two elements. When the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus over time, okay? From the beginning, it will just elicit unconditioned response. But over time, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. So the dog started to respond to the bell. That is the conditioned stimulus. So under a condition that there will be food, if the bell rings, then there will be food. Remember this conditional statement in critical thinking. If the bell rings, then there will be food. So this is the condition here. That's why it's conditioning. So the dog expects that when the bell rings, there should be food. So when it was paired over time, it elicited conditioned response. It elicited conditioned response. The dog is now behaving to it under a condition. What type of condition? Classical conditioning. I hope you understand. Good. So these are the elements in classical conditioning. We are not done with that though. How then do we identify classical conditioning? Through the acquisition. So number one, some of the features of classical conditioning, we can talk about acquisition. We can talk about extinction, stimulus generalization, and all that. All these things are present in the house when we build classical conditioning. Okay, so now I have finished discussing all this. As usual, then I go to the slides so that we just brush through it. In the next 3 minutes, 50 seconds, we'll be going offline, and then we'll come back with the same link. Okay, so we have the unconditioned stimulus, which elicits unconditioned response. We've talked about that already, as you can see. So the unconditioned stimulus here in the Pavlovian studies was the meat powder. We shouldn't forget that. When we are solving questions, which hopefully we will start tomorrow, when we are solving questions, we should always pay attention to the fact that the unconditioned stimulus is what the organism is actually interested in or not interested in. Okay, so in the case of the Pavlovian studies, it was the meat powder. In case, so the dog is interested in the meat, not the conditioning stimulus. In the case of the breastfeeding mother, the lactating mother, the child is interested in the breast. Okay, the child is interested in the breast and not the applied substance on the breast. Okay, okay, good. So unconditioned stimulus elicits unconditioned response. We talked about that already. So they said the unconditioned means the term unconditioned is used because the response does not depend on any previous experience or conditioning with the stimulus. Anyway, we don't need this because we have explained already. Okay. Neutral stimulus, we talked about that already. Conditioned stimulus. And this I'm going to go about the slides. So if I'll explain everything. Then I'll just show you, present this to you so that you know that if you actually know the things I'm talking about, you've noted the terms down and you can understand them. You don't need to be chewing slides. You actually know them. It's not about chewing it. You actually know them. I hope you understand. Okay, so conditioned stimulus will elicit conditioned response. Good. Pavlovian experiment of classical conditioning. We've discussed that already too. After pairing the bell and the meat powder for a long time, the dog began to associate the sound of the bell with the food and salivated when it heard the bell ringing. This is because the bell had become a conditioned or learned stimulus. So you see, we've talked about all this. So neutral stimulus, that is ringing of the bell, response, waking the dog up. That was from the beginning. It was nothing. It wasn't any condition. The dog wasn't conditioned under the bell to salivate for meat powder or anything like that. Okay, so we have one. So all this we've talked about them. So now the bell plus the meat powder. Neutral stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus. In the beginning, it was given unconditioned response, but over some time, it gave conditioned response when even the bell rings on its own without even the meat powder. Okay. So higher order. I think we'll continue with this in the next after this break. If someone has a question, we have less than 1 minute. If you have a question, you can go ahead. If not, then we'll meet to continue from here. High order conditioning. What does it mean? If you have a question, you can go. Let me stop this. Okay. And let me unmute. You can unmute yourself and then talk if you have a question.